Hi everyone, I'm Marie Harf. I am a 2003 graduate of Indiana, which I'm very proud of. I'm a former State Department official and CIA official in the Obama administration and prior to that at the agency. But the real people you want to hear about are the gentlemen sitting with me who need no introduction, but especially for our students, I'll give you some highlights of their careers so you know who you are so lucky to have here on campus. Senator Dick Lugar, Congressman Lee Hamilton, 2 Presidential Medal of Freedom winners, the co-conveners of this conference that we've all been at today, and both distinguished scholars at the School of Global and International Studies. Senator Lugar served 6 terms in the United States Senate. He led on issues like nuclear nonproliferation, food security, free trade, energy independence. He's currently the president of the Lugar Center, which focuses on a lot of the same issues and also focuses on bipartisan governance. Congressman Hamilton, to my left, was in the United States House of Representatives from 1965 to 1999 when he became president and director of the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. He was there until 2010. Also founded IU's own Center on Congress here in 1999. There's more on them in the booklet, especially for our students. Get to know them. You are so lucky to have both of them as we are today at the conference as well. Given the title of the conference and everything happening in the world, I'm going to start by posing a very large question to both of our distinguished panelists. We could spend hours talking about this, and it's something they've both thought about quite a bit. I will turn to you first, Senator, and then Congressman, to ask you this fundamental question. What is the U.S. role in the world today, and what should it be? If you could wave a magic wand, and we could, like I said, we could talk for hours about this. But it really gets at the heart of all the panels we heard this morning, whether it's Asia, whether it's democratization. Over to you. And then you're up next, so start.
Well, our role in the world is to be a leader with cooperation with as many countries as possible. We are a leader already on the military side with a fleet all over the seas. We are a leader in foreign trade and the wealth that comes to our country and to others throughout that situation. We have been a leader throughout our history in terms of new citizens who have come to the United States as immigrants and who have given to our country a great deal of talent. Most of us come from a background from some other country. We are a country, likewise, that has tried to exemplify freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and a governmental structure of checks and balances that made possible a strong executive in our president, but likewise a strong representative leadership in our Congress, and strong judicial authority in our Supreme Court and all the related federal courts. And that has gone down to the state level, likewise, with governors, legislators, judicial people there. All of this has been of help, I believe, to countries all over the world. And as I've already indicated, we've benefited from countries all over the world through trade and through immigration and through the ability, really, of our fleet and our ability to fly or by ship go to other countries as we do as tourists and to receive them.
Mm-hmm. Congressman?
Well, Marie, so far you're off to a good start. You asked the hard questions to Dick first.
Mm-hmm. I have a plan here.
That's the rule we're going to follow. Dick will take the hard questions, I'll take the easy ones. And if we follow that pattern, you'll get along very well, Marie. Dick's comments are on target, of course. A couple of comments in addition. I want the United States to take an active role in the world. I'm proud of the role that the United States plays and has played as we're a leader. We don't call them all right. We make some big mistakes. But I'm of the school of thought that thinks that the world's a better place because of U.S. leadership. I've been impressed through the years how our leaders try to do the right thing for the United States and its interests, but not that alone, for the interests of all the world. And that's been constant in our policy. And I've been impressed with how often our presidents and others in position of leadership will end the discussion, or towards the end of the discussion will say, what's the right thing to do? And try to focus on that question. The second thing I'd say is that I want to see the United States promote world order. We've worked on that for a long time. And by world order, I have in mind the rule of law, the sanctity of borders and sovereignty of nations, free and open trading systems and markets, and working to promote the well-being of all people, providing as best we can liberty and justice for all. The third thing I would say, that in just a very simple terms, I want to see U.S. role in the world to be characterized by being a benign power. I have been impressed over and over again with when the U.S., the perception of the U.S. power in the world goes up, worldwide perspective. And almost invariably, it seems to me, we bump up when we do good things. When we lead on Ebola, for example, or when we take the lead on hunger. Dick spent a lot of time on that. I like that. I like America to be known as a benign power. And the reverse of that is also true. I don't like it when I see the United States not acting as a benign power. So I have a lot of expectations for American power in the world. I hope I'm not Pollyannish about it, but I have often taken pride as I have seen our leaders struggle with some enormously difficult problems worldwide. The easy problems don't land up in the Oval Office. And I've seen American foreign policy destroy the health of American presidents as they have wrestled with the complexity and difficulty in trying to answer the questions that you raised. Bottom line, I guess, is that I think we should have a measure of pride in our country because what it tries to do.
Senator, I'm going to pick up on something that, that Congressman Hamilton said, and it's the idea of leading through international cooperation. You both have worked on multilateral agreements, whether it's in the non-proliferation realm, certainly, or others. And it seems to me now in the United States, and we heard this a little bit this morning on one of our panels, that there's a trend to look at international deals, whether it's the trade deals like TPP, whether it's the Paris Climate Accord, as zero-sum activities, in that there are winners and losers, and you hear the president use that rhetoric, and not to look so much for places we can agree on interests and negotiate from there, but look to always win, quote. Say a little bit about this and whether you think this is a new trend and whether it's maybe has some unintended negative consequences.
Well, for the moment, in terms of current events, you've mentioned the TPP treaty. This was a negotiation in the last administration that continued over into this one that would have brought about trade in the Pacific, including China and Japan and a great number of countries. Very important, really, to have all of these countries trading and to have the rules of the road. So our backing away from that was unfortunate. We have counted upon NATO in Europe to provide peace, and that's occurred for over 50 years. The only 50 years really in the last millennium there has not been a war in Europe. That's good for Europe. It's good for us, because we've been drawn into two large world wars because of the European wars, as a matter of fact. The president, in his first trip there, indicated that he was most interested in the dues that the members were paying. He did not talk about Article 5, people coming to the aid of others, and that was disappointing. And we're still then with the so-called Paris Agreement on climate change, backing out of a treaty in which the nations of the world are really groping with the problem of what do we do with CO2 or other gases that are going to affect all of us. The next generation of our children may really be hit with all kinds of situations. The water is rising quite apart from the kind of smoke that's in the air in Beijing and so forth now, where the Chinese have become very active in this area. So to be out of that. And then we had an agreement, marvelously, I thought, with Iran that involved China, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and ourselves, the so-called Iran deal, to try to at least delay the development of Iranian nuclear weapons for 10 to 15 years, and to have international inspectors there to destroy a lot of the nuclear material that was already on hand. And the president has not backed out of that completely, but we're coming up to a date in a few days in which that could see us leaving that group likewise.
Do you think he will leave the agreement?
He has certainly indicated that he feels that was the worst deal that we ever made. And on the other hand, technically we may bump past it as we did when this occurred a few weeks ago. I hope that is the case. But it's, I mention all of these situations because they are ones compounded by the president's view of immigration, his unilateral orders by executive order that Muslims could not come in the country, and likewise all the problems we've been having with the DACA group, unresolved at this point. Really the thought that a wall should be built in the South to hold off immigrants, that clearly is a very different kind of outlook and foreign policy view. And finally, with free trade, the situation of imposition of tariffs with regard to aluminum and steel. Now, this has been modified not to include Canada and Mexico, thank goodness, because we're in another negotiation there of the NAFTA treaty that we hope will not be a loss. It's been very, very important, not only to American farmers in a big way, but to a lot of us who are involved in various foreign trade situations. It's just an unusual period of time with sort of underlying a cut of 30% in the State Department budget,
right.
Likewise in foreign assistance budgets, and sometimes they characterize an empty seventh floor of the State Department.
That's right.
The lack of appointment of people really to do the job diplomatically, the lack of appointments of ambassadors to various countries, including we have no ambassador to South Korea right now at a very important time.
Exactly.
As we're dealing in that area.
Well, and I've often said, for those of us who are creatures of Washington, that personnel is policy, right? Who you appoint or who you choose not to appoint says something about your policy objectives, and budgets are also policy. So the idea that there was a proposal to cut so much of the State Department budget, I think, was concerning to a lot of us who believe in diplomacy as a tool. And Congressman Hamilton, I want to turn to you on this. This idea of winners and losers in the international system, this idea of how we're going into negotiations, whether it's with the North Koreans or on other issues, it seems to me like there's less of an emphasis on diplomacy as a tool to solve problems right now, and that there's a lot of emphasis on the threat or use of force. And one thing I think we probably want everyone to take away from today is that diplomacy can work when it's used in a smart way.
Well, I agree with that, of course. Military force is enormously important. And I don't ever want to make light of the necessity of the United States having a powerful national security force. On the other hand, Maria, as you suggest, most of the problems we have to deal with, we solve, not all of them, most of them we solve through diplomacy. Talk, talk, talk. Doesn't always work, often does. And in any event, you can almost always reduce the tensions and make at least incremental progress in resolving the problem. I believe if you look at the problems that worry you the most, my guess is the international type problems, that we can't solve them by ourselves. Now, I don't want to understate the role of America. As I suggested, I think it's vital. Do you want to sanction Russia or Iran? We can't do that by ourselves. Maybe there was a time when we could do it because we were so dominant in the world. But if you want to choke Iran or choke Russia, if that's part of our policy, you're going to have help.
Right.
To do it. So we do have to lead in the world. Now, there's a tough problem for America, and that is we can't do it by ourselves. And this idea of I've lost my train of thought here. The idea that you were expressing.
The idea that in the world there are winners and losers, and that there aren't
that's
mutual
enough.
interests.
That's all
okay,
I need.
that was my prompt. It worked. This is why we work well on these panels together.
Yeah. It seems to me our policy has never accepted the idea of winners and losers. And that's very strange to the traditional American foreign policy. Mm-hmm. Our idea has been we're all in this together. And that if we pursue our interests to bring peace and stability and prosperity to the United States, we do that not in the context of cutthroat competition with other nations, but in the context of all of us working together to advance our interests, our prosperity, our security, our safety, but at the same time advance similar interests to other nations. So I obviously agree with Dick here. The America First idea just seems to me to be incompatible with the American leadership as it has been performed over a period of years. And I think it's the way to attack our problems going ahead in the same context.
I think for all of you out there, both of these men on stage with me represent a real bipartisan tradition of thinking through tough foreign policy issues in smart ways, even if they didn't always agree. I know Senator Lugar worked very closely with my former boss, John Kerry, with then Senator Biden on the committee, and the congressman did as well. So now I'm going to ask them to evaluate the institutions they both served in, because I think what you just outlined, Congressman, about American foreign policy seems to be the thought of a lot of members of Congress, or it used to be at least, on both sides of the aisle. The tension between Congress and the president always exists on foreign policy, but it feels today like we're in a different place with Congress, and there's been a breakdown of bipartisanship, particularly on intelligence issues, on issues like Russia. Take a stab at how your former institution is handling this really challenging time.
Well, look, I think it's quite clear. The United States president is the principal actor in American foreign policy. That's it. American foreign policy is made by very, very few people. Now, a lot of us have an input. A lot of us can voice our views on it. But the decisions on American foreign policy, the big decisions, are made at the Tuesday noon luncheon. It used to be Tuesday noon luncheon. I don't know what it is now, where you get the American president, the national security advisor, the secretary of state, and whoever the president wants for lunch, and they make the decisions. And it's very important for us to recognize that executive power is the center of American foreign policy in decision making. Now, having said that, the United States Congress plays an important role. It always has a voice at the table. Dick and I have sat in the Oval Office a good many times when presidents have turned to us and said, okay, they always have the same question, incidentally. What do I do now? That's it. Incidentally, that's the question I kept wanting to ask all the panels this morning.
Right.
Afternoon. What do I do now?
I agree.
I don't think I answered that too well most of the time, but that was the question. So the Congress plays an important role, but we have to understand that it is a role in the formulation of policy. It is not a role so much in the implementation of policy. And that's a big difference. So one of the things that is very important in the relationship is for the Congress and the president to understand the constitutional provisions relating to the powers of each with respect to foreign policy. And for each institution, White House, Congress, to stay within the lines, roughly, the parameters of what their responsibilities are under the Constitution. Not always easy to do, but I think it's the path forward.
Do you think both institutions are staying in their lines, or understand, is this a good balance right now?
Right now, look, the key that has to take place here is consultation. There has to be good communication between the president and the Congress. And incidentally, communicating with the Congress is a pretty formidable task.
That's putting it nicely,
because
I think.
you got 535 members, all of whom think they know how to run the world.
And could be president.
And most of them would like to be president. So it's not easy to get the right kind of consultation. And one of the there are a lot of problems on consultation, but one of the problems on the executive branch side is that when they really don't want to consult with the Congress, basically. The Congress is a obstacle to deal with rather than a partner in the process. That's my view of the mindset of the executive branch most often, with all due apologies to those who served in the executive branch. But one of the problems is they want to consult with the Congress at a crisis, but they don't want to consult on an ongoing basis, week to week, day to day. And if you don't consult on an ongoing basis, consultation in a crisis doesn't work so well,
Right.
because you don't know the partners that well.
That's right.
So consultation is a key, but it's a complex phenomenon that has to be carefully nurtured in order to make the system work properly.
Senator, do you agree with the congressman's general thoughts on the Congress versus the president? But also, when you look at your former colleagues, do you think in the Senate that they are doing a good job of consulting, of advising on foreign policy in a very tough world right now?
I think I'd make 2 points. One is that with Senator Biden, Senator Kerry, you've mentioned, they served for quite a period of time when Democrats had the majority, as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. And they had a view which I shared as the ranking Republican member, that America's face to the rest of the world really needs to be as unanimous as possible. That is, if we had 19 members of the committee, we ought to be aiming for a vote of at least 17-2 rather than 10-9.
Right.
And that it was the responsibility of both of us, Republican and Democrat leaders, to try to line up those votes. Now, in that context, the presidents, Reagan, the 2 Bushes, President Clinton, as I recall, frequently invited several of us to the White House. We sat around the table. They understood what we were about, and they were appreciative of that fact, and that was very important, that correlation of views at that particular time. Now, occasionally, just picking up that's a variation that was very substantial. Sam Nunn and I, Sam was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and we were both appointed by President Reagan, along with about 14 other senators, to go to Geneva, Switzerland in 1986. President Reagan felt this might be the beginning of negotiations with the former Soviet Union on arms control, on nuclear arms control. That didn't turn out to be the case, but the fact was the president was very wise in knowing that you needed the votes in the Senate, 2/3 of them, if we got a treaty with the Soviet Union. And it was best to have the senators there on the ground, and we went over there within a definite period. We might have been there for several weeks. I remember former Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska, in fact, rented an apartment on the basis that he was very likely to be there.
You were staying a
kind of
while.
But it was interesting, the idea of a 2/3 majority. Another interesting time came when Sam and I, who had met some Russians there in '86, and continued to keep in track with them. In '91, had these Russians come to us. We sat at a table in Sam Nunn's office, and they told us we were in trouble. And I said, "What do you mean?" They said, "Well, the Russians that were guarding the nuclear weapons that are aimed at you, the United States, are deserting. We can't pay them. We're bankrupt. There could be accidents." The so-called mutually assured destruction doctrine, which thank goodness we've been spared for 40 years, it could come into operation in a terrible way. I said, "What do you want from us?" He said, "A lot of your money, because we're going to need to pay these people and get us started again. And we may need your technicians to get the warheads off of the missiles and the missiles down, and maybe even your troops, we hope not, we're in a sentence of dissolution." And in fact, a few months later, after this visit, the Soviet Union did dissolve, but we got the Non-Nuclear Cooperative Threat Reduction Act passed in the meanwhile. Provided initially $100 million for the United States to come and intervene literally on the ground. And it took 20 years to move from roughly 9,000 plus nuclear warheads aimed at every city, every military installation in the United States, down to 1,550 with the New START Treaty just a few years ago, which made a big difference in the world. Now, at the time, President Bush was not certain exactly what had happened. Some of his cabinet said, "You guys, Nunn and Lugar, are not President or Secretary of State. How dare you be negotiating with Russians on something as serious?" But he got over that, and we took a plane ride over to Russia and Belarus and Ukraine with General Burns, who was there on his staff, and likewise we had David Hamburg, and we had Bill Perry, and all sorts of people. And as I say, we all got religion together. We saw how desperate this was in these countries, how dangerous it was for us. And this led literally to the appropriation of the sums of money that were considerable, but at least a degree of safety.
Right.
I just add one more anecdotal thought about this, because one time when I was out in eastern part of Russia, I went down into a silo. We just pulled a very large missile out of the silo that had 8 warheads, so-called independent reentry vehicles on it, going to 8 different cities in the country. I got down there, and there was a table where the guards had been, and there were pictures of American cities around there. And I looked carefully to see if Indianapolis was one of...
Just making sure.
But when I got back to Washington, I said, "Was Indianapolis ever targeted?" And he said, "It sure was." While I was mayor of Indianapolis, a single one of those weapons could have annihilated the entire population, whether I knew about it or not. These are the hazards of the world, and the necessity for presidents and Congress to work together to look for every opportunity.
It reminds, what you just said reminds me of where President Trump spoke to President Putin on the phone last week, and one of the parts of the readout that hasn't gotten as much attention is President Trump said that they discussed the arms race, and that was the term he used. And he said, we both agreed that it's not a good thing, but then he said, but of course the U.S. still needs to be the most powerful. How do you read those comments by the president? How do you see this relationship that he's developed with President Putin on affecting this issue specifically? We don't need to go into the rest of it.
Well, I don't blame all of this on the president, but I would just say that, unfortunately, in recent months, it's apparent that Russia has been building some more nuclear weapons. Now, these are small weapons, as opposed to the ones we were taking care of before. And correspondingly, the president has indicated that we want to build some small weapons that might be used in sort of a tactical way in battlefields, not ones that you send over to annihilate a city and so forth. We're back into, if not an arms race, something that's really suspicious in that respect. In other words, there clearly is no motion out there to get into arms control or negotiations again. Rather, as you're suggesting, the president is saying we're going to be stronger and we're going to beat them out. If necessary, we're going to have more.
Right. Congressman, do you, I mean, on the topic of arms control negotiations, the President Trump is likely, reportedly, going to sit down soon with the North Koreans. And what are the kinds of things he and his team should be doing in preparation for this meeting? And what are the expectations that we should be looking for? You know, I keep saying one meeting is not going to solve this problem, and it's unusual to start at the presidential level, certainly. But I would like maybe a dose of reality for the room in terms of what we should look for coming out of this.
Well, this approach reverses traditional American foreign policy. We've always approached difficult problems by having all kinds of discussions below the top policymakers, the diplomats, members of Congress, all kinds of people working on the problem. And as you get the problem and its components defined and sharpened, and the issues sharpened. What are the core issues is not always an easy problem to answer. But as you go through the process of dialogue at lower levels and the prominent issues rise to the top that can only be solved by the top people,
Right.
That's the way we've traditionally approached the problem. Now, in the North Korean situation, Marie, which you raised, we've reversed that process, and we're going to have the two leaders sit down and talk about it first before the preliminary work is done. That worries me because the risks are very high. And if you break up a conversation between the two leaders, where do you go? So I'm worried about that process. Now, there are also things that bother me about it. We want the denuclearization of the peninsula. I don't think what we think about as denuclearization is what the North Koreans think about as denuclear. In other words, I think there's a big gap in the understanding. So that both may sit down and talk about denuclearization, but they're very, very far apart on what they really mean by that. Those are the kinds of things that ought to be resolved in the earlier process. I don't know how it comes out. Now, you could argue that we haven't done all that well the system we got. And maybe we need to throw the long ball here. I don't buy that argument, but it's a feasible argument that can be made. Let's try a radically different approach to trying to solve the problem. I'm skeptical of that personally.
Right.
But may I add this on the question of American foreign policy, a couple of things, I guess. One of the things I think we have to answer in all these disputes is what are the core interests of the United States in the problem? What's our policy today in Syria? And what is our core interest in the Syrian situation? What about Afghanistan? What interest do you and I and the American people have in Afghanistan? And why should we be involved and how should we be involved? I don't think we address that question with the rigor that we should. We seem to kind of fall into these things
Yes.
and approach it incrementally in short term. So core interests, what are the core interests? Now, I would argue, for example, that the kind of government that you have in Afghanistan doesn't make all that much difference to those of us in Bloomington, Indiana. But what is a core interest of the United States is that you don't have ISIS or some other extremist group plotting and planning to come after us or after our European allies or whomever. That's a core interest. And so our policy should be based on our core interests more often, it seems to me, than it is. And the second point is sustainability. We Americans are very impatient people. And believe you me, we jump around on solving problems. You don't succeed in foreign policy unless you have a policy and you sustain it. And that's hard to do, especially when you have the kind of things that we were talking about, executive separation of powers and all of that. But sustainability, I've often thought, as I've dealt with foreign policy problems, can we sustain this policy? Are the American people willing to provide hundreds of millions of dollars to promote democracy in Iraq? And how long are we willing to do that? If you're going to do it for 3 or 4 years, you're just wasting your money. If you're going to do it for a generation, maybe you got a shot at it. And we don't think enough about long term. And that leads me to think about resources. We want to promote democracy in the world, right? Wonderful objective. But come on, folks. We can't promote democracy everywhere and get anything done about it. You have to recognize the limitation of your resources and keep your objectives tied to your resources, what you're willing to do and for how long. And I would often ask myself the question, can I go back to Southern Indiana and argue this policy for 2018, say, but what about 10 years from now and so forth? So sustainability is a big deal, and I think we have to think more in terms of our long-term core interests in foreign policy, and can we sustain that policy over a period not of a year or 2 or 3 years, but for a long, long time.
Well, and I think it strikes me that the question of interest is often one that we who've served in government, that's a big conversation that often gets pushed aside because of the daily press of business, or you're dealing with crises. There's a really great new book out by Steve Call called Director at S, and it's about our war in Afghanistan. And one of the key themes that runs throughout the whole book is, starting in 2001 to basically today or a year ago, we've never agreed as a government on what our core interests in Afghanistan are. Is it just preventing the return of al-Qaeda and their ability to attack the homeland? Is it a version of democratic government? Is it rebuilding roads and eradicating opium? These are all different interests. Are all of them worth committing American men and women in uniform? Those are big questions that often get lost in the daily crisis and press of business. And Secretary Kerry, who I worked for, used to talk about foreign policy being driven by interests and values, and oftentimes they work in concert, but sometimes they don't. And so when you look at a country like Egypt, for example, we have certain values we want to promote there in terms of democratic government or in terms of rights for its citizens. We also have security interests that are a counterweight to that. So the real policy challenges often become when you have to balance interests versus values and how you come down on that, and what American resources over what period of time we're willing to commit, which is a big question. It is time now for me to turn to your big questions, though, in the audience. I'm sure you all have many for the congressman and the senator. So there are people with microphones. Please wait for them to come to you. I'm going to start right here in the center aisle. She has a microphone for you, if you could briefly say who you are and your question.
David Keppel, Bloomington.
It's on, yep.
David Keppel, Bloomington Peace Action Coalition. And I would like to thank both Senator Lugar and Congressman Hamilton, not only for your extraordinary service to the nation and the world, but also for your extraordinary openness, even to inconvenient citizen activists. Ms. Harf, you commented that personnel is policy. Following the appointment of John Bolton, the last sentence of the lead New York Times editorial on this called upon Congress to reclaim its constitutional authority over war making. And so I would like to ask Senator Lugar and Congressman Hamilton whether you would favor congressional initiatives such as the one sponsored by Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts to restrict the president's ability to use nuclear weapons first in a conflict without specific congressional authorization.
Who would like to? Well, and it's a broader question than just the use of nuclear weapons. The discussion we've had about the authorization for the use of military force, Congress is still operating under one that was passed after 9/11, for example, in much of its overseas activity. So would either one of you like to?
Well, I would hope, first of all, that there would be leadership in the House and the Senate in the Foreign Relations Committee and and the House committee to begin to articulate just about what we heard. In other words, it's very, very important right now for there to be leaders in the Congress at a time in which many of us feel that the president's ability really is somewhat limited by the lack of knowledge of many foreign policy questions. And so I think that right now I appreciate that Senator Corker and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee has been attempting to try, but he's going to be leaving.
Exactly.
There are, in the House of Representatives, I'm told, 40 Republicans who are leaving the House. In other words, the question of many members of Congress is that they are either weary of the administration or not prepared to keep battling, and so they just leave and say, my time has come. We're going to have some people really stepping forward at this point. Likewise, getting to the point that we were just discussing, there need to be people in the State Department, the Defense Department, who begin to formulate strategy. That is, we don't have a strategy in Syria or Afghanistan or these various other places. The president is not formulating a strategy, but somebody needs to. There need to be people who are forthcoming here. I would just say that we're in a period of transition with no Secretary of State for the time being, and perhaps a very difficult time for Mr. Pompeo to be confirmed. We don't know how that works out. John Bolton doesn't require confirmation, but this clearly is a very serious appointment, to say the least, with regard to all that we've been talking about presently. In other words, I'm hoping some leadership is going to step forward in the Congress and to be helpful to the president, not only to challenge him, but to indicate that these are parameters, at least of our foreign policy, that we need to be attending to.
Right. Do you think that leadership is forthcoming from Capitol Hill?
I stand with the founding fathers. Pretty safe place, don't you think?
Always. It's a pretty
Look,
good place to be.
They're very clear on this point. The president is the commander-in-chief, right? The Congress shall declare war, right? Back of those clauses is the view that when you make the gravest decision a government makes, do you go to war, it is a shared decision, not a unilateral decision. I think that wisdom holds. I do not want a president by himself ordering a nuclear strike. I don't care who the president is. Don't fool around with nuclear weapons. They are awesome in their destructive power. So it applies a fortiori, the Constitution, to this case. Now, that means, in practice, that the Congress, in whatever manner, would have to share in that decision to use a nuclear weapon. I don't trust the president to do that. I don't trust the Congress to do it. The best answer is the answer the Constitution provides for us, a shared power.
More questions? Yes, I'll come to the middle right here.
Hi, Senator Lugar, and thank you for all of you for coming. Senator Lugar, I was going to ask this question myself since I'm Jordan Summers. I work as a specialist in Ukraine, but since the issue came up regarding the Iran deal, I was thinking about it and writing some notes to myself concerning it, and I am a little interested as to know why there is such support for it, given what we do know about it. Leave aside the issue of the $140 billion and how it will be spent with the world's greatest sponsor of terror, the only country on earth that is committed to annihilating another state. The fact that there are no anytime, anywhere inspections. We know that the International Atomic Energy Committee If it suspects Iran, it gives it up to 24 days notice if it suspects it of cheating. If Iran objects, the issue goes before it and the P5+1 nations, and 4 of these must vote for sanctions to be reinstated. Secondly, we also know that the deal does not guarantee access to military sites, that Iran can establish or move nuclear facilities to whatever area it wishes, and then label these military. In 2015, U.S. intelligence informed Congress of evidence that Iran was sanitizing its suspected nuclear facility at Parchin in broad daylight after agreeing to the deal. And finally, it did nothing regarding innocent Americans being detained in Iran. On top of all this, these are my concerns that I have with the deal. When he spoke at American University in August of 2015, Barack Obama likened those who opposed this deal for the following reasons to those in Iran who were chanting death to America. That made my blood boil for these reasons, that anyone who would simply be opposed to this deal for the following reasons that I gave would be likened to that. My question is, why is there still such support for it?
So, do you want to start on that? And I'm also happy to answer that. I worked on the Iran deal at the State Department with Secretary Kerry, so I could spend hours talking to you about it, but I'll let the senator answer first.
Let me just say that the Iran deal seems to me denotes some progress in dealing with the Iran nuclear issues. And furthermore, because it included Russia, China, Great Britain, France, and the United States, it was a very, very important agreement. It's not easy to get those countries all together on the same page, but it did have at least the effect, it seems to me, of some delay in the Iranian nuclear progress as they saw it, and likewise offered opportunities for some inspection by the international community, if not as complete, at least as has been suggested in your question. I would just say that it's not easy to come to a deal with regard to nuclear weapons in a country like Iran or any place else. But it's not easy, likewise, to pull together China, Russia, and our allies in NATO, and we're going to need all of these countries. They were important in terms of the economic sanctions that probably were the reason Iran came to the table at all, that the economic hurt to the country was very, very substantial. This is a thought as we take a look at North Korea as to what kind of economic sanctions there might bring North Korea to the situation. So I make no defense of the Iran deal in total, but I would just say it was progress, and I appreciate the fact we made some.
And my addendum to that would be, if you just look at the nuclear issue, today Iran had to give up 98% of their enriched uranium. They cannot enrich uranium to weapons grade. They destroyed their plutonium reactor. There are hundreds of international inspectors crawling over every part of the nuclear program in the country. Now, so I would defend the deal on its merits, but President Trump is in office, and if my argument has always been to my friends on the other side of the aisle, if he wants to replace it, it's incumbent upon him now to come up with something better that Iran and the rest of the world would agree to. That when you're a candidate, it's easy to criticize something. When you're governing, it's your responsibility to come up with a better policy. And if he were to walk away and tomorrow Iran restarted its nuclear program or kicked out inspectors or took down the cameras, making sure they're not making a bomb in those facilities today, that decision is on his desk. And so you may not like parts of the deal, but the decision today, we are where we are, and it's incumbent upon who's in leadership now to either chart a different course, explain how that course would prevent Iran from getting a weapon, and then implement that. And so far, we haven't heard an alternative. We've just heard, I don't like what we've got now. That's what I've sort of said to I would defend the agreement on its merits, having worked on it for 3 years, and because I believe it's a good deal. But now someone else is in charge, and you can't just not like things. You have to be for things when you're the one in the Oval Office, I would say. Do you want to weigh in on this, or do you want me to take another question?
I think the gentleman states very effectively our complaints against Iran. They're serious, every one of them that you mentioned.
That's right.
And the ideal world would be to sit down and solve them all. We can't do that. We tried. Now, you can criticize the American negotiators and say you didn't push hard enough and so forth. I don't know about the details of the negotiation. But they felt, and I've talked with some of them, that they got as far as they could. They got a pause, nothing more, in the Iranian nuclear weapon development. That was the most serious problem we had with Iran. We had a lot of problems with them, but this was really serious,
Right.
developing nuclear weapons. And so the negotiators focused on that issue and tried to make progress. Did they make the progress that you and I would want? No, they did not. It was a pause. It wasn't a halt to it. So the question becomes, diplomacy can only get you so far, and you deal with the problems where you can make progress. And whether or not you've pushed the opponent as far as you can go, we don't really know, do we?
Right.
But we did make, as Dick and Marie have said, incremental progress on the most important problem, a pause. It gives us a breathing space, and it gives us time to work on the other very real problems that you mentioned. Iran is a very tough problem for us at the present time, and you're quite right about that.
More questions. Thank you. More questions. Yes, I will come to you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Alex Tomic. I'm a second-year student here. Congressman Hamilton, I like you a lot because you're a very straightforward man. So I'll ask you a straightforward question. Do you think that we should focus more on, instead of focusing on democracy in the world, do you think we should focus more on democracy here and restoring our crumbling institutions?
Well, it's not an either or choice, is it? I mean, the answer is we do both. The important point I draw from your question is that, look, our political and economic example are among the greatest assets we have in the world. And we all know that our politics and our economy, as great as they are, have serious problems that we have not solved. But we're striving. We're seeking a more perfect union. So we have to understand that we have to improve the performance of our institutions in this country, and that in doing that, we are setting a better example for the world to turn to democracy and freedom and liberty and justice for all. So we have to do both. And it's not an either or situation. But I do think it's very important for us to recognize the connection between our democracy here at home, its strengths and its weaknesses, and how that impacts American foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And the better we do at home, the stronger our foreign policy will be.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to come down. Wait for the microphone. It's coming to you. So we'll take a final question and any final thoughts both of you would like as well.
At the end of World War II, General Marshall wrote a letter to President Truman which began with the following words. Mr. President, it is my duty and my pleasure to be able to report for the first time since I assumed this office that the security of the United States is entirely in our own hands. My question is, do you think such a statement could be made now in the view of the existence of the states of Iran and North Korea with the regime such as they have and such as their presumed activities indicate? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful question to end on. The gentleman quoting post-World War II for the first, a letter to President Truman, for the first time, the security of the United States is entirely in our own hands, that we were in control of it for the first time. So the question is, could you make that statement now with Iran, with North Korea, I would add with terrorist groups still looking to attack the United States? Could you still make that claim?
Well, I would indicate that it would be unlikely you could make that universal of a claim. It could be, even though General Marshall felt that way when he wrote to President Truman, that it might not have been true precisely then with regard to the United States and the rest of the world. I think we are always going to have potential difficulties and problems. This is one reason why we try to bolster the strength of our own democratic institutions and likewise our military forces and those who are dealing in foreign aid and assistance so that on several levels we attempt to bring about greater security for the United States.
Congressman?
Well, I think the security of the United States is largely in our hands, but not exclusively. Look, the Russians have the capability today to blow us off the face of the earth. And from my understanding, all they need to do is hit a few buttons. That affects the security of the United States. We can't do anything about that in terms, well, we can do some things about it, I guess, but our security doesn't rest exclusively with us because what other nations do impact our security for sure. So I just would quarrel with the word we have all control of our security. We have a good part of it, but not all of it.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. We hope you join us tomorrow. Ambassador Samantha Power is giving the keynote. She's wonderful. We have great panels too, so thank you for coming today, for coming to our panel, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.